Our speaker tonight will be Ralph Martire. Martire, right. Okay, and he is here and ready to go. He'll be talking to us about the CTBA. You know what the CTBA is. It's the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Also the Illinois General Fund. It's a social and economic justice through data, social and economic driven policy, whatever that might be. We'll find out from Ralph. Okay.
Richard, guess what?
Without any further ado, we will hear from our speaker, Ralph Martire.
You may want to check that.
Yeah.
You can
All
remove
right, so I am Ralph Martire. I'm Executive Director of the Bipartisan Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. And yes, we are committed to social and economic justice, but we get there in an odd way. We look at the funding side of the ledger because frankly, if you don't have adequate resources on the front end, you do not get adequate outcomes on the back end. It's pretty much that simple. So we try to tie the fiscal side of the ledger directly to the social service and or education, et cetera, policy side of the ledger. Now, my group is bipartisan, and that means my board of directors neither likes nor trusts each other very much. And that allows us, actually, as staff, to focus on best practices and data. And I'm here to tell you something that may be different from most speakers or most perspectives. We honestly don't care if an initiative is liberal or conservative or somewhere in the middle. If it's supported by the data and it comports with best practices and it meets demographically driven needs, we support it, period.
Hey.
We don't even look at the ideological underpinnings. Now, a lot of what I do deals with tax policy. It's not impossible. You come work at our organization, you'll see it's absolutely true. But I love doubters. And tax policy is not a happy subject. And I talk a lot about the state's budget, an even less happy subject. In fact, I'm frequently told there's not nearly enough sunshine in my presentations. They're all doom and gloom. So here you go.
I feel better.
I have a little piece of sunshine, and that'll be it for the good news for today, as it will now start digging into the reality that is the state budget in Illinois. One of my favorite starting points is a slide like this, loaded with numbers and data. But this is the general fund budget for the state of Illinois for the current fiscal year, 2015. Overall, the state's going to spend about $35 billion. $10 billion was spent before they took a vote. These are hard costs they have to pay by law. And you'll see there's three primary categories there, right? Debt service that we owe to either for pension bonds that we floated or capital bonds. Something called statutory transfers out. These are statutorily required payments we have to make by law. The two biggest are Medicaid transfers, because Medicaid is a jointly funded program between the federal government and the state. And so we have to put in our Medicaid money, and that's about 1.4 billion of that. And about another 1 billion of that is the local government distributive fund. The state of Illinois actually shares its state income tax revenue with local governments on a per capita basis, and so those are the two biggest lines in there. Here's the pension contribution, $6 billion. Most of that is debt service. I mean, I think of all the fiscal policy issues that make it into the media, the pensions are the most poorly reported on, period. So I don't want to disappoint anyone in this room, but our pension system isn't Cadillac. We don't have outrageous benefits. None of that stuff is actually the cause of the problem. If you look at this big $6 billion pension contribution, what you have to understand is almost $5 billion of that is debt service. We, for decades at the state, made the policy decision not to put in our contribution to fund benefits. And then we wrote an IOU that bore interest at 8.5% per year for decades. And now, we're in a repayment. We set up our own repayment by law. We're in a repayment period where the payments jump from year to year at an incredible rate. So it's repaying this past debt that's causing the big pension problem in Illinois. It's not benefits for workers. In fact, the normal cost of actually funding the benefits we owe to our workers is pretty small. It's about 1.2, 1.3 billion out of that $6 billion figure. So that leaves $25 billion to be appropriated to public services. And here you can see how those appropriations were made. Healthcare, $7 billion, early childhood, K through 12, higher ed, social services, public safety. Group health, this is actually the insurance policy on state workers, and it's underreported. They never budget the full amount. And a lot of doctors have stopped seeing state workers actually because the state is about a year behind in paying its bills. Self-insured. And then everything else. My favorite line in any budget is this one down here in Roman numeral 5. Unspent appropriations. You see $500 million for that. What that means is the General Assembly, the governor, they knew they didn't have enough money to fund all of these services at this level this year. So they're going to cut them by at least $500 million unspent appropes. They just aren't telling us what or when yet. So there you go, that's transparent government. And our net expenditures on services then this year are scheduled to be $24.5 billion. I've been told not to take questions during or it just creates a whole balloon. Let's have our match later.
The money owed to the pension, is that owed to the pension funds or to bondholders outside?
To the pension funds,
Okay.
directly to the pension funds. So what we did was we didn't make our contribution to our own pension funds, we wrote a promissory note, and we established a repayment schedule to those funds. So you've all heard we're in a tough fiscal position. You just saw we have a $35 billion budget. How bad is the state's fiscal condition really? Legitimate question. All right, so we're going to have about $35 billion in revenue this year. We have $35 billion budget, so it sounds right, but there's a problem. Projected hard costs, remember those things we have to pay by law, no votes taken? That's the $10.8 billion that comes off the top, and here's our little kicker. We have a $6.5 billion deficit left over from last year. By law, has to be paid before the end of this fiscal year. So has to come out of current revenue this year, which means that only leaves $18 billion for current services. As you saw, even netting out the unspent approach, we plan to spend $24 billion, keeping that $6.5 billion deficit, just rolling it over another year. What this really means is a lot of social service providers and healthcare providers get paid very, very late. They have to wait anywhere from 6 months to a year to get paid on their bills. And I don't know if anyone here has actually tried to run a small healthcare facility or a small social service provider. Awful tough to meet your rent and make your payroll when the state, who's your biggest funding source, is not bothering to pay you for months on end. So that's 26% deficit. We have a 26% deficit in the service portion of our budget. Now, why is that important? And the next slide will show you if I can get this to talk. I hate technology. Can I just say that? I've actually taught technology law at Northwestern Law School, so that really makes it funny. I'm just going to advance that there. The reason why this is such a problem is 9 out of $10 that are service dollars at the state level get spent on just 4 things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. This actually is an analysis that goes back 35 years. 9 out of $10 get spent on 4 things. So that entire budget deficit is in our expenditures for services, because you can't cut the hard costs. You can't cut your debt service. You can't cut what you owe bondholders. You have to pay by law. So these are the things that get cut, which is why when politicians talk about resolving our budget problems with across-the-board cuts, across-the-board cut sounds a lot better to people than I'm going to cut education, and I'm going to cut health care, or I'm going to cut social services. People tend to support those things. Now, in a political environment, right now we're cutting everything, by the way. And in fact, in the last 6 fiscal years, without even adjusting for inflation, we've cut these 4 service areas by $4.7 billion. in nominal dollars. A lot more after you adjust for inflation, but 4.7 billion. So right now we're cutting everything. Historically, we have singled out one of these services for the most cuts. And you're going to help me determine which one that is right now politically in this room. So let's think about it. The budget process is a highly political process, right? Highly political. You don't have enough money to fund services that all poll well with your constituents. But you're going to cut something to just keep the wheels from coming off. Show of hands. Who here has a kid? Does anybody here have a kid in the room? Child? Anybody? Show of hands. A few do. All right, that's great. Hands down. Show of hands. Who here has actually ever been a kid? Anybody ever been a child in the room? Ah, there are 2 hands that haven't gone up. I'm really concerned about you that crawled out of an egg or something. But the bottom line is education usually won't be the first thing politicians cut, because all their constituents understand the value of education. They all went through the system. So politically, that causes you more damage if you're coming back to your constituents and you're cutting education. Healthcare. Anybody here ever have to see a doctor? Show of hands. Anybody? Once again, voters get this. So it will not be the very first thing a politician opts to cut. Let's jump down to public safety. Want to come home to a safe environment, no gangs, no drugs, of course. Then there's human services. What are those exactly? Well, I will tell you what they are from the state level, at least from a funding standpoint. No. That's all right here. All our prisons are right here in public safety, all state funded. As you can see, it's a very small part of the budget. Human services, 54% of all human services expenditures in Illinois, 54%, so more than half, are 2 things: developmental disabilities and mental health. You get up to 3/4 of all our service expenditures on human services when you add in the Department on Aging, so caring for seniors. And the final 25% is every other social service the states provide. So it's the entire budget for DCFS, caring for abused and neglected kids. It's domestic violence. It's child care for single working parents. It's substance abuse. It's AIDS. Everything else. So now, politically, show of hands, who here has, let's say, a developmentally disabled adult living with him or her in your immediate family right now? We have 1 hand. Maybe 2. But nowhere near universal. And that's why it gets cut first. Because most voters have no idea. And they certainly don't experience it. So in a political process, when you've got to cut all good things, I know they like to talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. This is Illinois. Okay, let's get a line item for waste, fraud, and abuse. They like to talk about that, but the reality is 9 out of $10 go to good things. They don't have enough money to fund all these good things. They can't meet existing needs. They're going to make cuts. They're going to cut those things that harm them the least politically, and that means social services. So in Illinois, and I'm going to give you some of this data later on, but I'll throw it forward now, which has the 5th largest economy of any state in the nation. Our annual economy is almost $700 billion. In Illinois, we decide to balance our budget, and politically have for decades, on the backs of our most vulnerable people. That's the low-hanging budget fruit. So being fiscally bankrupt actually encourages the somewhat morally bankrupt decision to really take away core services from vulnerable populations. Let's see if this thing will work again. Now, being bipartisan, my organization would absolutely support additional spending cuts if there were any data at all that legitimately supported the contention spending on services was a driving cause of our deficit problems. If we were profligate, if there were evidence of that, we'd be all over it. There's none. This blue bar compares the 2015 budget in nominal dollars on those 4 core services to the year 2000. And if you don't adjust for inflation, it looks like we're spending more, 19% more this year. That's an absolutely meaningless comparison, because inflation drives up the cost of delivering public services, just like it drives up the cost of living in a home or running a business. The middle bar compares our expenditures in 2014 in real terms to 2000, adjusting for inflation using the Consumer Price Index. The second you adjust for inflation, what you see is we're actually spending 23% less on those four core services of education, health, social services, and public safety this year than we did in the year 2000. 23% less in real terms. That's a pretty significant cut. And it also understates it a little bit. The inflation metric that we used here is a pretty good one. It's the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. You're all probably pretty familiar with the CPI. It's a great inflation metric for the economy as a whole, right? But because of that, it's not really a good inflation metric for public sector spending. It includes things like Clorox bleach and hair care products. State government doesn't buy a lot of Clorox bleach, or, well, at least since Blagojevich has been gone, hair care products. Well, I mean, oh, come on. He was pretty. Yeah, come on. What state government buys is labor. Every one of those four core service areas, education, health, social services, and public safety, are labor intensive. In fact, 80 to 85% of our expenditures are the wages and other compensation payable to the online workers providing these services. So there is a more accurate inflation metric that goes to the cost of labor over time, the employment cost index. Using the more accurate employment cost index when you adjust our investment in 2015 for those four core services and compare it to 2000, we're actually spending 28% less.
Okay.
That's a pretty significant cut since the beginning of the 2000s. And clearly, outrageous spending on services isn't a driver of our deficit problems in Illinois. And just to make it clear that we are now cutting everything across the board, here are each of those categories of public services adjusted for inflation, and you can see everything, even pre-K through 12 education, has been cut since the year 2000 after you adjust for inflation. So the politicians have lived up to one of their promises. They have in fact implemented across the board cuts.
Gene, would you like some?
Oh, this thing is...
Yes, whatever.
Some of you might be aware that the temporary tax increase that was passed in 2011 is phasing down. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
It's been in the media. My organization was very much in support of the temporary tax increase, although we said it should not be temporary, it should be permanent, it should be a little bit more, and it should be graduated. But I just wanted to show you the impact of the revenue from that temporary tax increase to sort of display the canard that's out there that we didn't really need the revenue. The green bar shows you the state's actual accumulated deficit each fiscal year from 2011 through 2014 through last year, including the revenue from the temporary tax increase. Now remember, over this sequence, in addition to having that new revenue, as I told you, we cut spending in nominal dollars on those four core services by $4.7 billion. Those are significant cuts. What if we didn't have that revenue, but we made those cuts? In other words, we made all those cuts to spending and just kept our budget where it is today. Well, last year, 2 years ago rather, in 2013, the budget deficit would have been $23 billion. All of our expenditures on services are $24 billion. Last year, our deficit would have been $31 billion. That's more than we spend on services, and heck, our whole budget's only $35, including our debt service. We'd be running over 100% deficit in the services and close to 100% deficit in the whole budget. Frankly, that revenue kept the wheels from falling off state government. And there was no blow up in spending. I'm going to have to continually do this because this is not talking to that. So this year, to get into the 2015 budget that they just passed, they cut services by $400 million. But they also played a few games. They bumped up their revenue projections. They just made it bigger by $200 million. Yeah, we're going to have $200 million more than we were saying, okay? They borrowed from other funds. They have to pay this back next year, $650 million. And they prepaid some of their hard costs. This is a nice fiscal maneuver. Instead of using money in 2014 for 2014 bills, they prepaid some hard costs that were due in 2015, particularly Medicaid costs, to get federal match in the budget quicker, leaving the deficit in place. So mind you, add all that together, 200 million, 600 million, and 600 million, you get to 1.46 billion. That they don't have the revenue for next year. That was one-time revenue. Smoke and mirrors, when you hear about it, here's the smoke and mirrors. That won't be there next year. So they're going to have to, if they're going to not cut services by 1.4 billion, just from what they did on smoke and mirrors, they got to find a new 1.4 billion in revenue, or services have to be cut dramatically. What I didn't tell you is that temporary tax increase is phasing down. So that next year, come on, work. Oh, I hate you. Next year, we're going to have significantly less revenue than this year. In fact, next year, we're going to have almost $3 billion less in revenue from the phase down of the temporary tax increase than we had this year. So you add that 1.4 billion, you're looking at a $4.4 billion revenue hole next year. They don't do anything on the revenue side. Now, another, I think, frequently misstated canard is that Illinois is a very high spending state overall. Well, maybe we've been cutting recently, but you know, we started off in a place where we were way inflated, so these cuts are rational and good ideas, et cetera, et cetera. You know, not so very much. In calendar year 2012, 5th highest population in the nation, 5th largest GDP, right? So those are both pretty high. 12th highest GDP per capita, 28th in general fund spending on services per capita. 5th largest population, 28th in spending per capita. And if you do the more accurate measure as a percentage of our GDP, as a percentage of our ability to fund services, we rank 36th in the nation. One of the lowest spending states in the nation. We are nowhere near meeting the demographically driven need for social services. And I will get into some greater detail on education in a slide or two. But the bottom line is every statement that there's a lot of waste, fraud, or abuse in state government, or that we're overspending, or that we spend more than our peers, it's all malarkey. None of it is supportable by data. None. And anyone that makes that case is really ignoring the data or intentionally trying to spin things. So, one last data point, because I do like to point it out. We actually rank 49th in the nation in number of state workers per capita. Next to last.
Yeah.
And you know, we were last until Indiana in that year outsourced a bunch of stuff that it used to do at the state level. It just threw it all on private providers, so they moved down to 50th. So they managed to get below us. There we go. So now how are we on tax burden? Well, this is the last data that's comprehensive, so it's before the temporary tax increase. So I'm going to adjust that in a second. But before the temporary tax increase, which happened in 2011, Illinois ranked 42nd in the nation in total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income. 42nd, 8 from the bottom. 5th largest population, 5th largest economy. Now what do I mean, because it's a legitimate question to ask, by total state and local tax burden? I mean every tax and every fee charged by the state or any unit of local government to support any public service delivered at the state or local level. Everything. Driver's license fees, property taxes, sales taxes, all those alcohol consumption taxes you pay. All that stuff. It's all in there. Now why do it as a percentage of income? It's really the way academics do it. It's the only way to get an honest comparison state to state, because some states have high income taxes, some have sales tax, blah, blah, blah. If you single out a particular tax, you usually don't get a good handle on what's going on there. And per capita doesn't tell you anything. Average per person. Let's assume, where's Tim? Tim, you're enjoying your meal? There's Tim. Let's assume Tim and I are in a bar having a cocktail. I do tax policy for a living, so I drink. This is a rational scenario for me. Now, we're in a bar, sitting at a bar having a cocktail, and if you were to look at our per capita income, our average income per person, it'd be pretty average. I run a nonprofit. Tim was telling me all of his volunteer time, so there's no way you're making a ton of money in the private sector. You have way too much time wrapped up helping people out, Tim. So the bottom line is, we have a pretty average income. Now, Tim and I are joined at the bar by Bill Gates Jr. Our per capita income just shot through the roof. Bill's the only one buying drinks for the house.
Do you want to move in extra toast?
So the bottom line is that distorts it. Percentage of income. How much of your income will state and local government take to fund services? There's a percentage that matters, because if they take 14% in Illinois and they take 17% in Mississippi, you earn the same amount in Illinois and Mississippi, you pay more taxes in Mississippi. So the bottom line is, we're one of the lowest taxing states in the nation. Now, we threw in the amount of revenue that the temporary tax increase generated. We didn't even adjust it for inflation. We threw it all back in 2010 dollars. And Illinois would have jumped way up from 42nd in the nation to 32nd in the nation. Still in the bottom 15, still one of the lowest taxing states, and that overstates the tax burden. So, myth number one, we're a high tax state taxing people out of here. No, we are not. We have never been. We've always been, up until very recently, in the bottom 10 in the nation in total state and local tax burden, period. Always have been. That data comes from the Federation of Tax Administrators. They just take the publicly audited data and put it online. There's no modeling here. It is what it is. Second, even with the tax increase, we're still low tax. Third, we're not high spending. We're low spending despite being high population. And so we're low spending, we're low tax, and we have big deficits. So something's broken, but it's not on the spending side of the ledger. You had a question.
What kind of, is that average income?
Pardon?
Is that average income? What's up? Percentage of income?
No, percentage of personal income, total personal income in the state.
Total personal.
Yeah. So now, despite being low tax and despite being low spending, we haven't generated a big economic advantage from this. Who has heard someone say something to, well, if we just cut taxes, the economy will grow? Anybody heard that?
Yeah, libertarian gibberish.
I want to say this as clearly as I can, and I run a bipartisan organization. We got Republicans on my board. There are no data anywhere that support that argument. Just none. And if you want me to talk later about the federal government and supply side economics, I'll be more than happy to. But the bottom line is, tax cuts do not equal economic growth or competitiveness. You can't make the argument. In fact, Illinois, one of the lowest taxing states in the nation over the last 40 years, we just went back 15 for this. You could go back 30, you could go back 20, it doesn't matter what time period. Our economic growth lags the much higher rest of the U.S. over that period of time. So it's not our low taxes that drive things. One thing that our budget deficit does drive makes us like the rest of the nation in a way that maybe we don't want to be like the rest of the nation. And that is we underfund public education. And in fact, a lot of people are so concerned, the media is so concerned, talking heads are so concerned about the broken public education system in America. Our system isn't broken. It is underfunded to educate all kids. And I'll give you a little data on that. So one of the things that I've done recently in my spare time was I was appointed to a federal commission on educational excellence and equity in the Civil Rights Division of the Federal Department of Education. And we look at American performance versus other OECD nations and a lot of other things. And one thing everyone gets very concerned about is, gee, America's test scores, when you compare us to the rest of the industrialized world, are middling. I mean, we literally are either a point above or a point below every year average. And we are way below usually 17 other OECD nations. So everyone's concerned about that. So we at the commission, we did a radical thing. We looked at educational performance by American school children, but we cut it out by poverty. Schools with 0 to 10% poverty in America had the highest scores on these international exams in the world. Higher than Finland, higher than Singapore, higher than all these people we say, gee, we wish we could figure out how we could beat them. The next poverty demographic, 10 to 25% poverty, fourth highest in the world. The exams are the PISA exams. Fourth highest in the world, and highest in the world compared to any other nation with a very similar poverty profile, like Canada, for instance.
Where's your large water?
American scores on PISA didn't start falling off the bat until poverty got greater than 25%.
Yes.
Where do you think America, in its current education system, invests most of its money in public education? The poorest kids? Or the kids that got some? In fact, on average, and there's exceptions to all rules, right? So there's going to be exceptions to these rules, but generally speaking, on average, those low poverty areas have significantly more resources to spend on providing an educational opportunity to their kids. Now, if you don't believe that that happens in a state like Illinois, I am an elected official, by the way. I'm on the school board in my home community of River Forest. Now, I think we actually have a zoning ordinance against poverty in River Forest, but the bottom line is there aren't a lot of poor folk in River Forest. I don't know if you've been to River Forest. And my wife and I decided to live there because of the public schools. We moved there specifically so our children could go to those public schools. Now, I live in the crappiest house with the least curb appeal and the smallest yard, and I eat a lot of bologna sandwiches. But I should tell you what my kids have gotten. So things like, in addition to their core curriculum, by the way, things like a great books class and their choice of 20 orchestral instruments, and I can't tell you the number, 4 different foreign languages, and science labs. Not only does every classroom have a smart board, but every 5th grader on up gets their own iPad. And we don't just train the kids on the iPad, we train their parents. And it doesn't just have their academic work, it has art and music too. Now, my kids have been getting this stuff, by the way, the great books classes, the orchestral instruments, since kindergarten. If you don't think the children in River Forest have an educational advantage over the kids in neighboring Austin or Maywood or Bellwood, kindly share what you're smoking with the rest of the room. We all want to be that happy. So the bottom line is, America hasn't forgotten how to deliver public education. But what America has done is backed away from providing adequate resources to all schools to meet the educational needs of all children. That's what the data says. Now, Illinois has particularly backed away from providing a quality education. So I'm going to delve into that now. Who here has heard about the foundation level in Illinois? Okay, we've got a couple. The foundation level, it's the minimum expense per child for K-12 education in Illinois set by the General Assembly. It's a number set by the General Assembly. And it's supposed to be the cost of buying your basic education. Now, our foundation level in Illinois, and it doesn't include a lot of things. It doesn't include special ed. It doesn't include transportation. Those are all funded separately. It's literally supposed to just be your basic education. Our foundation level in Illinois is based on, are you ready for this? Nothing. Nothing. It basically equates to what the General Assembly and Governor think they could afford per kid. It is absolutely tied into not one single actual cost of educating children. Now, Governor Edgar in the middle 90s said, hey, nothing is probably not the strongest foundation for education funding. So he appointed EFAB, the Education Funding Advisory Board, EFAB. And it's a nonpartisan group with expertise in the field of public education. And their whole job, EFAB's whole job, is to take this minimum expense per kid, the foundation level, and make a recommendation of what it should be per kid if in fact we wanted our children to satisfy certain academic standards. Now here's the standard EFAB selected. By law, by the way, I guess they didn't pick it, it was dictated to them by the General Assembly. What would it cost per child to purchase an education of sufficient quality to get 2/3 of the non-at-risk children passing tests? I'm going to break that down. It's 2/3 of the kids passing tests. 1/3 we throw right out the window. We don't even want to know. There's that federal law, what's it called again? No child behind is left. Right. NCLB. To be very clear, it's not enough to fund NCLB, which you're supposed to have 100% of your children passing your state tests at grade level by 2014, so good luck with that, America. Second, the EFAB standard isn't even 2/3 of all kids. It's 2/3 of the non-at-risk kids. At-risk is a term of art in education policy. An at-risk kid is at risk of failure academically, and there are 3 types of children that are considered at risk in this pot of children. Number 1 are children with special needs. Number 2 are children who are English language learners. And number 3 are children who come from poverty. The official policy of the state of Illinois is, we don't care what it costs to educate those children, we're not going to figure it out. That's our official state policy. So now back to the standard. EFAB is looking at what it would cost per child, what the foundation level should be, to purchase an education of sufficient quality to get 2/3 of the children with a reasonable likelihood of academic success passing our tests. Back in the year 2003, the state's actual foundation level was $120 less than the EFAB recommendation. In the 2015 budget, it is $2,500 less per kid than the EFAB recommendation. Now, we've actually run this differential through the Illinois State Board of Education's funding model. What would it cost to satisfy EFAB? $4.5 billion. So context. Today in Illinois, the 5th richest state and the richest nation in the world, our K-12 funding is $4.5 billion less than what it would cost to purchase an education of sufficient quality to get 2/3 of the non-at-risk kids passing tests. We at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability have decided that that is inadequate. I'm willing to hear counterpoints. Hearing none, I'm going to move on. Now, as I told you, a number of things aren't even included in the foundation level. One thing that's very much not included is poverty. Bless you. There's a whole bunch of data, in fact, unassailable data in education that shows if you want to get equal academic outcomes between a child who's in poverty and a child who's not in poverty, you need to spend a little bit more on the kid who's in poverty. You have to overcome some of those natural advantages that that kid doesn't have at home. Whether it's computers and books and magazines or two-parent, whatever it is, there are usually, poverty is a good proxy for a number of these disadvantages in the home of a kid that you have to make up for with some more money at the school level. So you have to spend anywhere, depending on the concentration of poverty, between 25% more and 2 times what you're spending on a non-at-risk kid to get equal academic outcomes. So the more poverty concentrates, obviously, the greater the cost. Illinois has something called the poverty grant. And a few years ago, and it's supposed to be this additional money over and above what goes to a typical kid. And a few years ago, we said, gee, we have a very inaccurate way of determining children who are in poverty in our schools, so let's go to a more accurate way. Let's go to the number of kids that are getting free and reduced lunch. That's a better picture of poverty. It'll increase our poverty roll. The top red bar shows you the increase in poverty payments annually from 08 to 2014 because of our change in calculation. Went from $785 million to $1.7 billion. So that looks like real growth. We're finally giving an investment into low-income communities to try to make a difference. The blue bar, however, shows you what's been happening with the standard foundation level. That's dropped from $3.6 billion in funding to $2.7. So look at the total. It's flat. The way they are paying for the increased money that we are putting into the poor schools is by cutting the money that goes into middle-income schools and somewhat poor schools. The net of this brilliant piece of fiscal policy, the net here, is not only aren't the poor kids now getting that bump over and above what the starting point should be, but now middle-income kids and somewhat poor kids are getting hosed. This is what happens when your revenue doesn't grow with your costs and with inflation. And I'm going to get at the end of this to the point that what we really have in Illinois is a tax policy problem that we need to fix. But I'm just trying to highlight how that tax policy problem honestly impacts core services in ways you probably never thought about. We are the only organization that has pointed this out. We've testified to this. EFAB is now shocked. They took this as official testimony, and all kinds of things are flying because we said, wait a minute, look what you're doing. But we still haven't gotten more money into the system. The even more brilliant part of education funding in Illinois. So now that you know our starting point is woefully inadequate, right? You know the state doesn't pay the full amount, right? It shares it with local school districts through the property tax. So nowhere does the state pay that full foundation level. They set it, and then they pay a little portion. The brilliance is they pay a very little portion. In fact, Illinois ranks 50th in the nation in the portion of education funding covered from state resources. You look at us down here, we're the red bar. Illinois pays 28% of the cost of public education. The national average is for a state to pay 46%. That means property taxes cover 60% of the cost of public education in Illinois. The national average is only 43%. That's first in the nation.
Oh, you already got your chocolate cake.
We are the most reliant state in the country on property taxes to fund public schools. The most reliant. Effectively, what that does is it ties the quality of the public education a child's going to receive to the local property wealth of the community in which the kid lives. If the kid lives in a community that has a lot of local property wealth, see River Forest, see Winnetka, see Barrington, they get a world-class education. If they live even in a middle-income community in Illinois, forget it. It's an inadequate public education. It is not competitive. And if you're wondering why these don't add up to 100, it's because the federal government covers roughly 10%. All right. So not only is that like an incredibly inequitable way to fund public education, it's an incredibly inequitable way to tax people. We so rely on local property taxes that local property taxes grow at rates that incomes don't keep up with. Here are the data.
Thank you.
From 1990 to 05, property taxes, we've taken out the impact of inflation here using the CPI, so this is in real terms. Property taxes in Illinois grew by 48%, median income grew by 2.7%. And it's because of school funding, to be very clear. Bless you.
Thank you.
So you have property taxes growing at a rate that's close to 20 times the rate of growth of income or more for most people. And in fact, the Great Recession really made it ugly. If you look from 05 to 2011, property taxes continued their northward growth. This is after inflation. Median income was down by 9 points. So the bottom line is, this poor tax policy, fiscal policy, results very much in inequitable outcomes, not just from an educational standpoint, but from an income standpoint. This exacerbates growing income inequality. All right. I just said that, we've been scaling back education, and it's probably not the best thing to do right now because I don't know if you pay attention to the data, but educational attainment is now more closely correlated with being viable as a worker in the current economy than ever before. Now, some of this data I'm assuming a lot of you know already, like this chart. Less than high school, BA or greater, unemployment rates. U.S., Midwest, Illinois. For the longest time, there's been a direct correlation between your educational attainment and your employment rate, right? The higher your level of educational attainment, the lower your unemployment rate is the BA or greater. I guess the only exception there is art history majors, and really no one can help them. Just not getting a job. I have one in my family. I love that joke. The bigger change, though, the meaningful change on the correlation between education and economic viability comes with wage. There used to be a time in America generally, in Illinois specifically, when you could just go graduate high school and get you a good job. Kind of job that'll put a car or two in your garage and a kid or two through college. That day is over. Since 1980, the only cohort of workers in America that have seen their incomes increase at a rate greater than inflation have a college degree. Every other worker is earning less today than they did in 1980 after inflation in real terms. You've got to learn to earn. The other thing we know that's Illinois specific about our labor markets is that the wage gap between whites and minorities keeps getting worse in Illinois, not better. So go to the first data point. From 1980 forward, the wage gap between whites and Latinos grew by 46% in Illinois. This is Illinois-specific data. Some of that is, frankly, discrimination in how we fund schools, but some of it's not. Some of this is neutral labor market forces at play. Because with Latinos, you have a significant immigrant population that is very willing to take low-paying jobs. You have English as a second language issues. So there are actually some reasons that are non-discriminatory that can explain part of the growth in that wage gap. Then jump down to the growth in the wage gap between whites and blacks over the same sequence of 92%. And start right here. As far as neutral labor market forces here, I got nothing.
What?
There's only two things happening. Intentional discrimination or unintentional discrimination in labor markets is still very real, and particularly for African Americans, and the way we fund schools in Illinois. So let me get to the discrimination point first, because that's usually controversial, and I'm just going to give you some like-kind data comparisons that can't be explained but for discrimination. So as you know from the prior slide, these are the hardest to employ folks, people without a high school diploma. So let's look at that population just before the Great Recession. So let's not even muck it up with the Great Recession where everybody did horrible. Whites, just before the Great Recession in Illinois, who didn't have a high school diploma, had a very high unemployment rate, 11.7%, very high. African Americans, 27%, more than double. Then you flip it to the top earners, our folks with a BA or greater. These are the folks in the top 10%. These are the folks earning money. In fact, if you're white and you have a BA, well, you're more than likely than not to be in that top earning bracket. 55% of the whites with a BA or greater in that top earning bracket. 23% of the blacks. So net, it really doesn't matter how you slice that data. You see racially disparate outcomes that are not explainable by anything other than discrimination in labor markets. It just is. But now let's get to how we fund schools. As you now know, Illinois is the most reliant state in the nation on property taxes and funding schools. The most reliant state. That means your local property wealth dictates whether or not you get a quality education. 55% of the black children in Illinois, over half, live in the 5% of school districts with the greatest poverty and the lowest property values. 93% of our black kids in Illinois live in school districts where the concentrated poverty level is 30% or greater. When did education and poverty become a real problem on international test scores? Is that magic 25% number. Net, what this has meant is that historically, in fact over the last 40 years on average in real terms after inflation, black kids get about $1,500 less per year spent on their education than do white kids in Illinois. Every year, K through 12. And our starting point is inadequate. So you've got an inadequate education system for everybody. And you've particularly singled out black kids for really poor education. But education matters more than ever to being competitive in a global economy. So if you do this long enough, you will disadvantage blacks in the labor market, and that will show up in your wage data, and it has. So the bottom line is, what we have determined at CTBA is that our education funding and tax policy combined and laid over each other end up with a structurally racist system. It wasn't the design to single out black kids for this poorly funded education. That wasn't the intent. But the work of these big policy structures does in fact do that. So since we know that it does that, I think it's incumbent on us, meaning not just voters, but our leaders down in Springfield, to change it. Because at some point, something that starts out structural does in fact, in my mind, become intentional if you know about it and do nothing to fix it. Don't you love this? Who woke up this morning and said, I want to see a graph of a structural deficit? Let's see a show of hands. One, two other hands. That's fantabulous. I normally am the only geek in the room with my hand up. This is the picture of why Illinois has these deficits, why we underfund schools, why we keep cutting social services, and really it shows the way that needs to be followed if we're going to solve these problems, at least rational. Nothing I've given you to date has involved complex modeling, right? Everything has just been simple math. We've taken publicly available data sets and done the math. We've cited our sources. You could go do the math too. We don't like modeling because a lot of times the assumptions dictate the outcomes. So modeling is a tricky wicket. When we do modeling, this is modeling, we tell people we're doing it, we send it out for peer review. This has been peer reviewed by 5 different academics, 5 different PhDs, including at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the U of I, Republican-leaning and Democratic-leaning PhDs, and the head of state and local tax at the GAO in Washington, D.C., the PhD economist. We use the same methodology that the Congressional Budget Office uses when it projects things forward. We assume no changes in law, historic rates of inflation, historic rates of change in population, normal economy. Those are our assumptions. Given those assumptions, if you started with a balanced budget in Illinois in 2014, your revenues and expenditures were equal. You now know we did not have that. We had a $6.5 billion deficit. Well, let's assume we started with an honestly balanced budget. You just adjust for inflation and population growth, you assume a normal economy. The blue bar is the cost of maintaining FY14 services into the future, plus our existing debt service, right? That you don't adjust for inflation or anything, the payments are what they are. Same assumptions, the red bar is our revenue. The gap between revenue and cost growth is the structural deficit. It's literally built into the structure of how we tax versus the cost of the services and the debt we've incurred. Now you'll notice there's this dip in revenue. This is the phase down of the temporary tax increase, right? So you can see it's a very meaningful thing. Even if we started with a balanced budget, it was going to create havoc. We've got a $6.5 billion deficit, so it's really going to create havoc. The yellow bar says what happens if you make that temporary tax increase permanent? Well, that's the revenue then. You see, we still didn't solve the problem. We get through 2014 and 15, but by 2016 we're showing a deficit. So if you really want to see the core of the problem from a math standpoint, look how, it doesn't matter which line you pick, look how flat the rate of growth is in revenue versus the rate of growth in costs. That's the problem. We don't tax like the modern economy. We don't tax like we're supposed to. So our revenues don't grow with inflation and population changes even in a normal economy. Our costs at a minimum do. If you're wondering what the difference is between the blue line and the green line, I'll tell you. We passed something that the state, I would have to say euphemistically called pension reform last year. I don't know how they considered that a reform. What it boiled down to is they cut a bunch of benefits for workers. It's unconstitutional, and it's going to get thrown out. The blue bar assumes that it's unconstitutional and it gets thrown out. The green bar shows you what happens if it's constitutional. Look at all those savings, folks.
Ron, this is the speaker.
See how that saved the day? It was one of the most disingenuous, hoodwinking
For you,
of the
honey.
general
Oh,
public
you're so
ever
sweet.
done. They backloaded all those savings out to here. They took a bunch up front so they could get through 2 or 3 budget years and threw a bunch back there and just assumed we could make the same payments that we can't make now. So the only way to fix this is to fix the revenue side of the ledger. Now I'm going to turn everyone in this room into a raging, meat-eating capitalist. Oh yes I am. Oh yes I am.
It isn't gonna happen.
It's my job. Well,
Get up and take a bow.
these are the principles of capitalist tax policy. How you design a tax system to work in a capitalist economy. Why am I using those principles? Our private sector economy is capitalist. And you fund your public sector out of your private sector. So you ought to use the same principles. There are 4 of them that are economic principles. There's a few other that are good government things, but this is Illinois, so we don't bother with good government. Fair, responsive, stable, and efficient. Those are the 4 principles you need to meet in designing your tax system to actually have it work in a modern capitalist economy. Illinois is 0 for 4, which is why we have that structural deficit. Now, if you think about it, fair, actually from a capitalist standpoint, I'm going to get into this in a little bit detail, means progressive. Higher taxes at the top and the bottom and middle. That's actually textbook tax policy. And right now, because I know there'll be a big discussion on what's fair in taxes, I'm just going to tell you, I don't care what you think is fair. I just don't. I care what the textbooks say is fair and what's proven out by economic theory. So your normative values, those are great for you, but if you're designing a tax system, do what the textbooks say is fair. And the textbooks say progressive taxation is fair. Sorry, that's just the truth.
Yeah.
Responsive to the modern economy. That means you want to focus your taxes where the economy is growing, not where it's declining. Hard to understand, right? Jesse James, rob banks, because that's where the money is. You gotta go, because if you focus your taxes where the economy is declining, you'll have a structural imbalance. Stable. You need revenue that's available even during down economic cycles, particularly at the state government level. 49 of the 50 states have balanced budget requirements. So you're not supposed to deficit spend. So if you don't have a stable revenue that's there even when the general economy is tanking, you're going to have a problem maintaining your investment. And actually one of the interesting fiscal catches of government, it's very different than the private sector. In the private sector, what happens when there's greater demand for what you're selling? Your revenue goes up, right? People are buying more of what you're selling, no matter what it is, product or service. In the public sector, generally speaking, demand goes up when revenues go down. You're in a recession, more people need public assistance. That's complete opposite of the private sector. And a lot of these folks that say we ought to run government like a business have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. They are very different models. I mean, do you really want let's take a place where even demand doesn't increase during a recession. Let's go back to education. Demand is pretty constant, right? Do you really want a principal to have the same options of a CEO? I'm sorry, Johnny, Jane, it's sort of a tough revenue year, you know, our numbers are down. So we're just not going to offer you 3rd grade. You go on off and you study on your own, and maybe we'll open a slot for you in the 4th grade when the economy. No, it's ridiculous, right? But yet we have these discussions as if they're rational today. So, stable and then efficient. I need to, here we go. So those are the principles. Illinois is 0 for 4. How do you get a stable tax system? You need your sales tax to perform this function at the state level. And the way you get it is to have a very broad base for your sales tax. The base of a tax is just what it applies to. So how do you get it? That means most of the things people buy, particularly in the consumer economy, have to be subject to your sales tax if you're going to have a stable revenue source that's there even during a recession. Why would that be the case? What is our economy? It is, oh, this room knows. What?
Manufacturing.
No. Consumer spending. It's people like me and you buying junk and such. That is the economy. 70% of the U.S. economy, Illinois economy, is consumer spending. Consumer spending doesn't decline very much even during a recession. How much do you think consumer spending declined overall in the U.S. during the Great Recession? 25%. Any guesses?
I think it's still about even.
We have a winner. It declined by 0.6%. So if you broadly tax what consumers really buy in the consumer economy, you end up with a stable revenue source that's there even during a recession. 47 states in America have a sales tax. Of those 47, Illinois ranks 47th for the most narrow base. We exclude virtually all consumer services from our tax base. Here's why that doesn't work. This is the percentage of services versus the percentage of goods being sold as our overall economy in Illinois from 1965 to 2012. What you see is in 1965, services, what we don't tax, was 51% of the economy. Goods, what we do tax, was 40%. By 2012, what we do tax had declined to be 17% of our economy. What we don't tax is 72%. Any questions for why that dog won't hunt? Right? This is an ideological, once again, this is math. You cannot leave the largest and fastest growing segment of your economy entirely out of your tax base and assume your revenues will grow with the economy over time. They won't, and they sure won't be stable during a recession. So yes, we need to broaden our sales tax base to consumer services, not business to business. That's pyramiding, not healthcare. All the data show that if you increase even co-pays by $1, low-income folks don't get preventative care. You don't want to create that disincentive. Professional services, look, I'm a former lawyer. I'd be all for taxing a lot of my peers out of existence, but the bottom line is no states really tax professional services. Illinois won't do it either. Consumer services, though, that's what you should tax. What are those? Haircuts,
I actually didn't add it up.
lawn care, health club,
Didn't give you the
bowling,
money,
that kind of
But I
stuff.
gave you a check that wasn't.
We need to tax them. If we don't, we'll never balance our budget. Now, will this make us Taxachusetts? No, it won't. In fact, not only do we rank last in the nation in the number of services we tax versus every other state with a sales tax, all of our neighboring Midwestern states tax services significantly more than Illinois does. And Iowa and Wisconsin tax, Walker's, Wisconsin, tax all of them. Have you seen busloads of people from Iowa and Wisconsin coming here to get their hair cut? No, right? They tax haircuts in those states. Have you seen their haircuts? They should come. So, the net of it all is, we have to do this to modernize our system or we'll never get rid of the structural deficit. Then there's fairness. Now, come on, I need some capitalists to join me in the room. I said it was a fundamental principle of capitalism that fairness is progressive taxation. That goes all the way back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. Published in
1776.
1776. Great American with a great American date. All right. Right in the book that invented the system. And I'm going to read this. I don't normally read a quote, but I'm going to read this. Adam Smith said, "The subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. That is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state." As Henry Home, Lord Keynes, has written, "A goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. That's Adam freaking Smith.
In this room, many people here are vomiting now.
It's not Karl Marx, okay? It's Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith had a rationale for this. He believed that if you actually implemented a capitalist economy, economic growth would always disproportionately advantage top income classes over everyone else. And by disproportionate, he meant just that. They would get more of the income growth in the economy than either their share of their population should command, or the value of their input to the economy should command. So since they're going to get this disproportionate return, they should have the greatest burden out of their pocket to support the government that effectively provides them with this nice disproportionate economic benefit. Was Adam Smith right? This is U.S. Internal Revenue Service data, adjusted for inflation, what Americans reported to the feds as their share in income over time. After inflation, you can see that from 1947 to 1979, the wealthiest 10% got 34% of all income growth, meaning the bottom 90% got 65%. Okay, disproportionate return to the top, but overall, a rising tide was lifting all boats in America at this point. After inflation, it didn't matter how you sliced the data, every income group was seeing real growth in income. Some more than others, but at least everyone was doing a little bit better. Things have changed. From 1979 to 2011, the wealthiest 10% after inflation got 139.8% of all growth in income in America. For the math challenged in this room, 100% is all of it. So if more than all of it went to the wealthiest 10%, that means on average the bottom 90% was earning less after inflation in 2011 than they were in 1979. So to be fair, you want to focus your taxes up here where people are paying it out of their growing wealth. Not down here where now, at least, people are paying taxes out of their growing poverty over time. Second way to look at that is, remember that second principle was being responsive to the economy. You wanted your taxes to respond to where the economy is growing. That's where it's growing, not so much. Illinois is the reverse. In fact, we focus our taxes on the bottom 90%, and in particular, the bottom 20%. We are the fifth most regressive taxing state in the country. So we have to fix that. And in a perfect world, the way you fix that is much like the federal government does, have an income tax with a rate structure that gets higher on higher levels of income, right? Lower rates at lower levels of income and higher rates at higher levels of income. You, me, we don't live in a perfect world. We live in Illinois. And Illinois has a constitution that requires a flat income tax. So anyone that tells you a flat tax is a fair tax, you could say they're a communist, they don't understand anything about capitalism, and they don't certainly understand anything about fairness. So there you go. There are ways to get there, to get to a graduated rate structure, even if you can't do it by constitution. So even with one flat rate, you could have large refundable tax credits for low and middle income families, for instance, that not only offset their income tax burden, but because they're refundable, offset their sales tax and property tax burdens too. And this is something that's, the earned income tax credit is a great example of it, and it's enjoyed great bipartisan support. I don't know if you know this, but the earned income tax credit at the federal level first passed under Richard Nixon, who supported it. But it was most greatly expanded under Ronald Reagan, who described it as the single best pro-job, pro-family, anti-poverty legislation Congress ever passed. So both sides of the aisle get that you should have this powerful tax tool in place, and in Illinois it's essential because we're stuck with this flat tax. So in all likelihood what we need to do in Illinois is raise new revenue over and above what we currently have, probably about $4 or $5 billion. And we probably need to bump up our income tax rate from the 5% level that's phasing down now to probably 6 or 6.5%. But if we did that, you don't want low-income families paying that. You want to give them this refundable credit at the bottom, and so that's how you balance things. Bottom line is, the arguments my organization gets against raising taxes are all economic arguments that are silly. They all say, well, if we raise taxes, we'll hurt our economy. I mean, you know every one of them, you can probably make every one of them. I just thought I would end with some data showing that how silly these arguments are. So 41 states in America have an income tax. 9 do not. 9 states have no income tax. This is a comparison over the last 10 years of economic indicators between the 9 states in America that have no income tax at all, and the 9 states in America that not only have an income tax, but have the highest top rates and highest average rates. The high tax states are the blue bars, the no tax states are the red bars. Average unemployment rate over the last 10 years, 6.1% in the high tax states, 6% in the no tax states. Statistical tie, no difference. Change in real median income after inflation. Everybody did bad, the recession happened. High tax states, they dropped by 4.2%, a little bit worse than the no tax states, dropped by 4.5%. Once again, not much there statistically. Growth in per capita real GSP, gross state product. Here, statistically meaningful difference, the high tax states actually outperformed the no tax states. The no tax states do include the miracles of Texas and North Dakota and Florida. They're in here. So net, all these arguments that if you just cut taxes or eliminate taxes, you'll grow your economy are silly. If you want more information about that, we did an analysis of all this tax stuff called Good for Business that really looked at all those arguments on does cutting taxes in fact grow business? The answer no, in a way. But that's on our website and you can see all the sites and stuff. Basically, you know what really encourages business to hire more people? This was a finding by the Congressional Budget Office. They did a research of federal tax policy even and found no correlation between federal tax policy and growth. But they did find one correlation. You know what businesses care about? Demand. People start buying more of their products or services and businesses hire more people. Taxes had nothing to do with it. So, that's it in a nutshell. Illinois' severe fiscal problems have in fact resulted in a very poor state from a service delivery standpoint. We've cut services for vulnerable populations for decades now. We're now even cutting them for things like education. We're hurting our own economic competitiveness by disinvesting in our people. And frankly, we should be ashamed at our lack of investment in social and economic justice when we're the 5th richest state and the richest country in the world. So we need some tax reform to fix our problems. Hopefully you're with that. And now I'll answer your questions.
All right.
Okay.
Well, we'll start in the back and move up. Because I'm assuming your vision and aim isn't as good.
Hold on for the moderator.
You go to outcutting services. I've worked in outcutting services for
Hang on.
22 years. And what we did was take people who were on welfare, who had been outsourced, and retrain them. We put about $3,000 per person, and it took anywhere from 1 month to a couple of years. On the average, maybe 4 or 5 months. Then we tracked them. We did a study. We tracked their income in the 2 years prior to them coming to us, and then for 4 years after. Guess what we found out? The first 12 months after they left us, we got every penny that we put into the participants, we got it back in tax money, plus $3,000 back, plus $250 bonus. The next year, we got an extra $250 bonus. We got more each year than we had put into them, and the amounts kept growing for 4 straight years. And at that point, we gave up tracking.
Great.
I mean, they paid, that was the tax money.
Yeah, generally speaking, just to make that a more global comment on what the data generally show, and not in every case, but generally show, data generally show the more you invest on the front end in preventative or in step-up type stuff that provide a pathway up, not only the more you save in direct expenditures, but the more you get tax revenue down. And there are multipliers between things like K-12 and other investments. And so that really is the case for most things, not everything, but for most things. And unfortunately, state government, get back to the reality that state government exists in, right? It's a highly political process. They're trying to get through this budget year. You know, a lot of the thoughtful, well, gee, if we just raise the taxes, it doesn't happen because raising taxes is anathema politically. So they don't frequently even get to this part of the discussion. But what you're saying from what you observed in your program is something that you see in many, I can't say all, but many.
Well, this was massive numbers of people, thousands of people.
Tim?
I just want you to comment real quick on how fast you think it will be before the taxes on internet sales will be coming into existence.
You know, I don't know. We support that, but it's way overblown. I mean, the differential it's going to make for the state of Illinois, the highest estimate is about 400 million. The typical estimate is 180 to 220 million. We have a $6.5 billion deficit, and we're about to lose our income tax. So we are focusing more on these big structural things. While that would be good public policy, it's just not enough to make a material difference. So we're not focused there.
Okay.
The young lady over here.
Yes, have you done any research on now how much revenue would a state transaction tax would
You know, we've
generate?
done a little bit of work on that, but from a research standpoint, we are absolutely doing no policy work on that. It's deader than dead politically. It just has no legs, and it'd be very hard for a state to do it. Now think about Illinois. Illinois has historically been a low-tax state in every way it can be. No other state has a financial transaction tax.
New York?
They refund it all back. It's a silly thing. It's a New York City tax. They take it out and they give it right back. No one ever pays it. It's fully refunded. It's there as a placeholder. So the New York thing is a non-tax.
Yeah.
There is no tax. We won't get that
He's right
tax.
here.
I think that would be an appropriate tax for the federal government to pursue and do it nationwide, and it'd be far more difficult to pay. I'm not saying it's not good policy. It's good policy. I just don't see it being politically viable.
Bill Wendt and Tim Bolger.
I hold here in my hand a very interesting article about Michael
I'll
Madigan,
get your bag, Marlene.
which covers a lot of the topics we've been over tonight. And was in Chicago Magazine December of last year. You can get it at any Chicago Public Library. Are you all familiar with this?
No.
The end of that.
You already had.
No, I already had a question. You got.
All right. Ernie?
Yeah, Ralph, you said there's no data to support that tax cuts increase GDP. I assume that this flips over, there's, or maybe it doesn't. Is there data to support the tax increases cut GDP?
No.
Okay.
So I guess, just to answer that part of the question, so we did a statistical analysis at the federal level, right? Because now you're talking national policy and GDP. So we have done an analysis looking over a very long period of time. I think it was from the end of World War II forward. And the federal top income tax rate and GDP growth.
Yeah.
And what you saw is sometimes when the top rate was incredibly high, our top rate has been as high as 91%. We had some of our greatest growth, and sometimes when the rate has been low, we've had some of our greatest growth, and vice versa. So there's no statistically meaningful correlation at all between rates and GDP growth on the one hand. From a supply-side economics question, does supply-side economics, the theory, hold water in practice? So the theory is, if you cut taxes at the top, the economy, you'll free up so much income at the top that these folks will invest in creating jobs, that it will trickle down, and the economy will grow at a faster rate, everyone will do better, and even though you cut taxes at the top, you won't grow your deficit, because everyone else is doing so much better, they pay more taxes. The data absolutely don't support that, and I'll just give you some numbers. from the end of World War II until 1980, after inflation, our national GDP growth was 3.8% per year in real terms, on average. Our top federal tax rate was 91%, so very high tax rate. That was the growth. And you saw in the chart here how income growth got distributed, right? The wealthiest 10% got 35% roughly, the bottom 90% got 65%. Then with Ronald Reagan in 1981, we've got the supply side revolution, and he cut the top rate, I forget if it was
From 70 to 50, right?
well, 75 or 76, no, down to 38.5. And then George W. Bush cut it again in 2001 down to 35. So if you leave out the Great Recession, because you don't want that to muck it up, from 1980 through 2009, the Great Recession started in December 2009, so it doesn't really impact the data. Average GDP growth in America after inflation was a full percentage point slower than it was before. It was 2.8%. There was no trickle-down effect. You saw what happened with income distribution. It very much skewed to the top over everybody else, and our deficits exploded. So basically, everything that was claimed would happen from cutting these top tax rates didn't happen, just the converse happened.
But I'm seeing a lot of articles here. I guess my real question is, can I be referred to some articles or places to get specific information on this? Because I'm seeing a lot of articles here which say that tax increases reduce GDP by 1, 2, or 3%. There's one particular group of researchers, I think Romer and Romer, are you familiar with that? They, they're one of them. Now, what do you have to say about their research? And where is the research that supports what you're saying?
Well, see, they have a model and we have math. So all we did was take publicly available data sets and did math. They have their own proprietary model with assumptions and whatever.
Is your data summarized here? By the way, Tracy sent me an article on the state, which was very helpful, but nothing on federal. Do you have
we haven't published much on federal. I've mostly done it for analysis for either at the request of some congressional delegations and or for speaking engagements. So I don't think we've actually done a published paper on it.
Is there a place or a paper?
No, I mean the research by Krugman and Stiglitz, you'll find some good stuff on that. I think Chickadee and Sayers have done some really good research here. What you're going to want to find though is peer-reviewed research and stuff that was subjected to outside eyes and stuff that wasn't paid for by a lobby.
You'll fail a drug test if you use this.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah, I'm interested in a response that is not what is politically dead, but is actual policy, as you stated, Ralph, something that's borne out by figures that you've researched. And my question is, along the lines of, why is it in Illinois that 70% of the corporations are not taxed, and isn't that the major problem in Illinois to move to a progressive taxation situation?
Absolutely not. So the answer to the second part is it's not the major problem. And the answer to the first part is a lot more innocent than you think. So the way tax policy is structured, corporate income tax policy is structured, is certain business entities are always exempt from the corporate income tax, no matter how profitable. S corporations, partnerships, limited liability companies. These never, if you form your business as one of those kinds of entities, you never have to pay the corporate income tax. Even at the federal level, you don't pay it. You're exempt. What happens is the owners of your business, let's say we formed a limited liability company, me, you, and you, and we each owned a third of it, and that business made $90 in profit. I would pay taxes on my personal incomes on $30 of that profit, as would you, as a flow-through, whether or not we got that 30 distributed to us. So they're just taxed differently. So I think a lot of the discussion, and right now in Illinois, roughly 67% of the businesses are formed as exempt, tax-exempt entities. So the bottom line is you're never going to get a lot of corporate income tax revenue that way, and it really isn't a barrier to going to a graduated rate structure. That's more ideological. That's more the people that say, well, I think what's fair is everybody pays the same rate, that kind of stuff. Or I talked to this business guy that says if we raised our taxes on rich people, he'd move to India. It's that stuff.
Let me ask a follow-up.
It's really not the corporate.
Let me ask a follow-up. How many members of the Civic Federation who are corporate heads are in corporations that pay a full share of Illinois taxes as the people in this room do?
No, I would imagine, I don't know. I mean, the answer is I have no idea. I've not looked at that. I'm not going to speculate on a number I don't know. But I can tell you most businesses, even, here's the reality. Once again, you guys got to pull our report Good for Business. All this data is in there. And I'll give you one more data point. So let's take out those businesses that never have to pay the tax, right? Which is about 2/3 of all the businesses. They would never have to pay it because they're exempt. They're an S corp. They're an LLC. Of the businesses that pay the corporate income tax in Illinois, 70% last year there's data for had zero in corporate income tax liability. Another roughly 20% had $5,000 or less. So 90% of the businesses really paid next to nothing. And a very small, it's like out of the couple 100,000 businesses that could possibly have corporate income tax liability, I think it was something like 200 or 300 that had $1 million or more in liability. And you can figure out who those are, right? That's like CTBA and Archer Daniels Midland, it's these giant companies. And the reason for that is they're not, our tax law is piggybacked on the federal tax law. And so there's a lot of exemptions and whatever they can claim under federal law that reduce their taxable income.
But that's something that could be changed.
It could be, but why? I mean, because that's a flow-through tax, it's not transparent. I would rather tax rich people directly than go after their businesses. Because their businesses will take that tax and add it to the price of the product or services they're selling, and you will end up paying. Right. So honestly, I mean, I'm just saying, from a tax policy standpoint,
Yes.
and the corporate income taxes is only about 6% of our revenue. Personal and sales are
David Zucker, then Matt Butler.
Yes, my question to you is this.
Louder.
My question to you is
Yes, I'll
this.
be right with you.
I've heard a number of people suggest the federal tax rate should be raised as follows. They should take the top 2% of the wealthiest Americans and raise their tax rates back to where they were under Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. How do you feel about this?
I haven't looked at that specific proposal, so I will just tell you what I think. I think at the federal level, taxes on the wealthiest 10% ought to be increased and increased significantly, and I don't care if you do it by jumping up the rate or getting rid of exemptions and deductions they could take, but the net is, I think you ought to tax affluent people more significantly than we tax them now, and we ought to tax low and moderate income people less. And I think that those investments are good investments, and net raise more money. So how you get there, you know, I haven't seen that specific proposal, so I don't know if it makes a lot of sense or not. I don't care. I'm more agnostic on the approach than I am the outcome.
All right. Matt?
Yes, sir. If I understand you correctly, what you have been telling us is the state of Illinois needs to increase its revenue very, very quickly by probably at least 40%. What would you consider to be the best revenue sources for doing that and doing it quickly?
Yeah, the two things that I would do is I would bump up our income tax rate from 5% where it currently is to probably 6 or 6.5%, but with that targeted tax relief for low and middle income families. So the net increase in revenue from that over and above what we have right now would be roughly $1.5 billion. And I would expand our sales tax base to include consumer services only. If you did that, that would generate roughly $2.5 to $3 billion. So there is my $4 billion, $4.5 billion of magic new revenue in. That would be enough to pay all the state's past due bills within 2 years and adequately fund education within 4 years after that and make up for the cuts that we committed to social services. So it works. So that's what I would do.
Yeah, I did like your lecture.